Hey y'all, I just beat Life is Strange Reunion and here's what I think about it as a fan of the franchise. In this video, I'll be talking about the story, characters, choices, and gameplay. Quick note about spoilers, with a game like Life is Strange, story is very important and thus it would be hard to make a review without talking about it. Because of this, I will be revealing some story details such as the setup to the game, as well as some details from the first half of the game or trailers. Despite this, I'm confident that you can watch this video before playing the game. The original Life is Strange is one of my favorite games of all time. Taking clear inspiration from Telltale games of the time, it has a fantastic story, great characters, and a really cool rewinding time mechanic. Sure, today the writing may be seen as cringy, however, at the time it was a really fresh take on a pretty set-in-stone formula. Ever since playing it for the first time, the concept of being able to rewind time just by sticking up your hand is something that's stuck with me. If you're able to get past some of the more dated elements, I think that what you'll find is a fantastic game and one that will stick with you for a long time. I unfortunately cannot say that about the rest of the series, however. Before the Storm is the next game in the series, the first in the series by Deck 9, and a fine game. Life is Strange 2 is by the original devs, and while it certainly is a step up from Before the Storm, I just don't think it reaches the same heights as the original game. True Colors is where Deck 9 fully took over the series and is easily the worst in my opinion, with really bland characters and story, and some not so great writing in there to round it out. The series was just slowly getting worse over time, and I found myself wondering if it would even continue, especially with the lackluster reception to True Colors. Double Exposure seemed to be a clear last-ditch effort for the franchise to me, kind of similar to what the MCU is doing now with its Avengers movies. Nobody likes the current things we're releasing, so let's just bring back a character everyone likes to make some easy money. Surprisingly, I think bringing back Max with DE wasn't entirely a bad idea, as I think the game does do a pretty good job at continuing her story. My issue was that since Max is so inherently tied to the events of the first game, it's really hard to continue that story in a completely new environment and with completely new characters. DE ended up feeling like more of a retread of the first game to me, with Safi taking the place of Chloe rather than continuing Max's story. Sure, the game was clearly trying to have Max deal with the events of the first game, which explains why she acts the way she does in DE's plot, but it just did not work at all and was not well written. Of course, everyone seemed to agree with me that DE was not a great game, and so thus, the bringing back of Chloe here in Reunion felt even more on the nose. Let's just try and milk as much money as we can from this franchise with one last game by needlessly bringing back everyone's favorite character. To my surprise, however, not only is Reunion not just a shameless cash grab, but it's also a pretty good game that elevates what was in Double Exposure, even if it doesn't reach the heights of the original game. Double Exposure had a pretty weak story to say the least. I don't think it's as bad as everyone seems to think, but I certainly think it has some huge pacing issues. Going from finding out Max is the one who killed Safi to investigating a book deal and teacher selling drugs creates some whiplash to say the least. The mystery is fine, and yeah, as the game goes on, it gets more and more interesting, but I can't say I was entirely invested the entire game. Thankfully, however, it seems that Deck 9 learned from this and made big changes to how the story is presented in Reunion. Reunion's story focuses on Max traveling back in time after seeing the Caledon school on fire and all of her friends dying. Her, Chloe, and Moses have 3 days to piece together how the fire started and who started it in order to stop it from happening and save everyone's lives. It sounds like a really simple story, and that's because it is. There's really only two major locations in the game, which are the school and the Abraxas house, and because of this, it subverts a major issue from DE. I never felt whiplash while playing this game because everything was seemingly always progressing. By making the story simpler and focusing on it more, it actually makes the story here much better in my opinion. There's nothing earth-shattering here. It is a pretty simple story with no real huge plot twists or anything. You always have some kind of lead to follow, and by finally ditching the episode/chapter format, the game doesn't have to force cliffhangers every few hours like the rest of the series does. It works as a pretty decent story and pretty good backdrop to everything else the game has going on. I think the best part about the story here is just how it works as more of a part 2 of Double Exposure rather than a sequel. Events from DE are directly continued and built upon here, coming to a much better conclusion in my opinion. Chloe showing back up is a direct result of merging the timelines at the end of DE, and because of this, the themes of Max coming to terms with the events of the first game is done so much better here. The game acknowledges that Safi had the same role as Chloe in DE and builds the story directly around that. It honestly made me feel a little better about the story in DE because I can now clearly see much of that was set up for this game rather than just being derivative nostalgia bait. Reunion does a great job at continuing Max's story, much better than DE ever did, giving it a reason to exist beyond just being a cash grab. Now, while I like the story here more in Reunion than I did in honestly all the other Deck 9 games, I don't think it comes even close to reaching the heights of the original. The story is my favorite thing about the original Life is Strange, mostly because of how high concept and just frankly batshit crazy that game gets. Something new happens in literally every episode, and the game balances the mystery of the weather, Rachel, and Max's powers together perfectly. I just don't think Reunion's story is good enough to carry the whole game, and I think people who don't have a connection to the first game won't like it very much, if at all. It's a simple story that's meant to be in service of the real point of the game. Like it or not, this game is built around Chloe and Max once again. If you don't have any preconceived connection to them, then this game probably won't do much for you. Directly from the start of the game, it assumes that you've not only played DE, but the first game as well. Chloe isn't reintroduced or anything, she just shows back up into Max's life and is immediately inserted into the plot. For some people, this may be a huge issue for them, especially if you don't like Chloe and Max for some reason. For fans of the first game like me, however, it's a real treat. Deck 9 Life is Strange games are much more focused on characters rather than the story, I'd argue, and Double Exposure is no different. Huge portions of the game are focused on character building, especially with the two love interests, Vin and Amanda. Unfortunately, I think that Deck 9 is also pretty terrible at getting you to actually like those characters. Besides Max, who I obviously already liked, and Moses, who has a relatively smaller role, I can't say I actually really liked any of the characters. This made the copious amounts of random conversations extremely boring and tedious, especially with the few characters who I actively disliked, such as Vin and Safi. Thankfully, it seems like Deck 9 has realized this here in Reunion. Since Chloe and Max are now the co-leads of the game, it's their friendship that takes a center stage here. The game almost never forces you to have a meaningless conversation with the side characters here. There's no reason to. Since this game takes place in the exact same location as DE with the exact same characters, the game doesn't have to develop them at all. Every single character is the exact same as they were in DE with absolutely no changes besides maybe Safi and Max. The characters from DE are now more like story vessels and are used as such. Reggie is now the head of Abraxas, Lucas is now an evil podcaster, and Yasmin is now the former president. For those who liked these characters in DE, I think this will be a real issue for them, but for me, who just didn't really care for these characters, I don't mind it. Because each character is now directly connected to the story and nothing else, I actually found them to be more interesting. Max and Chloe take the place of the forced character conversations in this game, but like I said before, they actually work here because I care about both of these characters deeply. Even if you decide to not build a romance between them like I did, their years of friendship and bonding from the events of the first game shine through. It's always great seeing a scene play out between them because as a fan, this is exactly what I wanted. More of these great characters together sharing their great bond. Max is, of course, a perfect replica of how she was in the first game, similar to DE. Chloe, however, is much more interesting than that. Chloe acts very differently than she did in the original and before the storm, although I'd argue it's for the better. Chloe is now around 30 years old in this game, meaning that she can't really act like an angsty teen like she did in the original. Reunion does a great job at making her much more mature while also still being distinctly Chloe. She's a band manager, still has dyed hair, and is still a bit standoffish at times, while also still very clearly being a mature 30-year-old woman. The writing here for both Max and Chloe is pretty great. There are still some cringy lines here and there, but they work for these versions of the characters. At the end of the day, she still feels like Chloe, Max still feels like Max, and their bond is just as great as ever. I do think one thing kind of brings the game down as a whole, however, and that's the facial expressions. This game has some of the worst facial expressions I've ever seen in any game, to the point where I actually think they may be glitched or something. Many characters have almost blank expressions on their faces most of the time, which can really impact some scenes. For a game that relies so heavily on having great characters and solid voice acting, it does a huge disservice to not have the character's face express the same amount of emotion as the writing and the performances. So yeah, while the story here in Reunion is pretty good, it's clear that the characters are where the main focus lies. By delegating most of the side characters to just being plot devices, it actually lets the game be something better. Max and Chloe trying to solve a mystery and saving their friends. It's as simple as that, and while some people may not love the blatant fan service here, I did. This game earned the right to bring back Chloe one last time in my opinion, and is a pretty solid conclusion to these characters' stories. I've seen some people argue that this game kind of ruins the final choice at the end of the original, and while I can see where they're coming from, I don't entirely agree. The impacts from that big choice are felt all throughout this game. No matter how things end up for these characters in the end, you'll know that the choices you make matter to the characters themselves at least, if not to the overall story. That's exactly how I describe the choices here in Reunion. They don't matter much, but they do to Max and Chloe. If you're even a little invested in this game and the characters, then they will matter to you as well. One of the first major choices in the game is when Yasmin asks Max if she's seen Safi around, and you can either say yes or no. Depending on your choice, Safi will react to it when you talk to her later in the game. Every choice kind of boils down to just that, where characters will just react to things you say to them. It's not exactly reactive story-wise, I'd say, but for a character-driven game like this, it's fine. Honestly, the whole your choices actually matter thing is so played out at this point that I never actually go into a game like this expecting my choices to change the story majorly. The story and characters react just enough to my choices to where it feels like I have an impact on this world, even if it is small. There is one major reaction to all your choices, however, and that's the ending. I won't go exactly into the ending much, but I will say that it doesn't change the ending to the story itself, but just some details about it. The ending seemingly hinges on three different things. Two major choices at the end of the game, one made by Max and the other by Chloe, and then finding certain clues throughout the game. Based on the amount of clues you find, as well as finding specific clues, you get different ending variations, it seems. I actually really like this clue system as it actively incentivizes a player to explore the world and interact with things they otherwise wouldn't. This is a great addition, although not enough for this game's gameplay, in my opinion. One thing that I love about the original Life is Strange is how it took the average gameplay from a Telltale game and completely flipped it on its head. It's pretty common to pick a dialogue option and get surprised upon hearing what is actually said. Life is Strange fixes that problem with the rewind mechanic while also making an entire game around that. You could just rewind and do everything perfectly, but the whole game is about why that may not be such a great idea. Gameplay-wise, you could not only rewind during conversations, but also many puzzles were built around the use of the rewind mechanic. It was all really fun and innovative for a game like this. It's a shame then that Reunion does no such thing like that. At first, it seems like the rewind mechanic is exactly the same, but as you get deeper into the game, you realize that it's just so much worse here. Like, you cannot rewind while talking to someone anymore, only when you're in a gameplay section. It seems like it's the same thing, as the game will regularly have you talk to someone to get information and then rewind. It's just not the same though, as unless you're actually in a gameplay section, you can't rewind at all. This completely removes a layer of choice from your actions on if you want to rewind to do a conversation differently or not. Honestly though, dialogue options don't really matter that much in this game, so it's still not that big of a deal. Puzzles also take a bit of a backseat here in Reunion. I think the Kate sequence from the first game is a really great example of a time puzzle, where not only do you have to get to her in time, but also say the right things. There's nothing even close to that here in Reunion. Most of the puzzles are simply getting information and saying it to someone, like I mentioned before, or doing something in a certain amount of time. Neither of these are really interesting in my opinion and are seemingly only there because they have to be to break up the pacing a bit. Chloe is the second playable character in this game and she plays almost exactly like she did in Before the Storm. She has a backtalk mechanic where you must say the right thing a certain amount of times in order to get someone to say something to you. This mechanic is used only 3 times throughout the game though, and are all very easy. She has maybe 1 or 2 puzzles, and they really are just typical puzzles for this type of game. Find an object, use it in a certain place, talk to someone, etc. You play as Max much more than you do as Chloe, so I don't mind the slightly simpler gameplay on her end. So yeah, the typical gameplay found here in Reunion isn't very different from the rest of the series, or this genre of game at large, honestly. Your choices matter about as much as they do in most games of this type, not much, but as long as you're invested in the characters and story and want to get the best ending, then that shouldn't really matter for you. The puzzles here are also a bit bland, especially compared to the ones in the first game, but honestly, I don't think they're here for any reason other than to break up the pacing a bit. Deck 9 clearly cared more about telling Max and Chloe's story rather than the gameplay here, and honestly, I think they did a good job of it. That's how I felt about this game as a whole. I didn't really mind a lot of the flaws here because I was just happy to be playing a good Life is Strange game again. The story does exactly what it needs to, Max and Chloe are just as great as they've ever been, and the gameplay does its job. Sure, the bad facial expressions aren't great, but what's here is good enough to let me forget about that. All this culminated in a pretty good send-off to this franchise and these characters for me. I don't know if I'll ever play this game again, as it's not nearly as good as the original, but I don't think it's trying to be. This game is for the fans, full stop. That may alienate new fans from picking it up, but I think old fans will love this. It's got some issues, but this game let me see Max and Chloe one last time, and I'm glad for it. I recommend Life is Strange Reunion, 7 out of 10. Well, y'all, that's my review of Life is Strange Reunion. I'd really appreciate it if you could like, comment, or even subscribe. That's all I got for this review, but I do want to take the last few moments to talk about me and my channel. Alright, y'all, so the thing I want to talk about is obviously the really big gap between this review and my previous one, which was the Fatal Frame 2 review. So I said at the end of that review that I hope to get it out next week, which was last week. That didn't happen, and let me explain why. So as I've been saying over and over and over, that last week was a really busy week for me. I had like 3 exams, project. I had a group project called the Crisis Case, which is like the hardest fucking group project in all of the business college I go to, and it was just like a lot, right? But I got it done. We did really good on the group project. We like won, so like we had the best group project in the class. I couldn't believe it. But anyways, like my last thing to do was an exam at 8 a.m. on Thursday, my accounting exam. So I took that exam, I got an 83 on it, whatever. But I got back home and then I went back to sleep and I woke up at like noon or 1. And I was like, I really don't want to get out of bed and write this script, right? So that's what happened. I was just like, I finally have a free day, like finally, the first time in forever, I'm gonna take use of it. So I've been like getting back into audiobooks. So I listened to The Martian, I finished that day. Then I started the like Harry Potter audiobook. I'm not a big Harry Potter fan, but I don't know. I decided I'd read it and I'm glad I did. It's pretty good. But yeah, that's what happened. And then like, obviously like, there's some things I had to do, like 2 classes the next day, work on Saturday, homework on Sunday, work on Monday, and now it's Tuesday when I'm filming this. So yeah, I'm just so sorry for the long wait, you guys. I didn't expect this at all, but it's like, it's hard to find the motivation to put all this work into these videos when I'm so busy. So that's what it is, right? I'm still gonna keep going with this, obviously, but it's just like, I don't know. I'm sorry there is such a long wait, you guys. So today is the day that the Starfield DLC is coming out. I was hoping to have this video done by then, but it's not, whatever. So what's next? Well, Borderlands 4 DLC is still going to be my next video, and then now the Starfield DLC. I've decided to put a hold on the Division game. Haven't even started it yet. Gonna wait until after I make my Crimson Desert review for that. I don't remember where I said I was at Crimson Desert in my last video, but I'm now at the start of chapter 4. Yay! But yeah, that's all I have to say, you guys. I'm just sorry for the really long wait for this one, but you know, obviously I'm not going to scrap this video, especially after writing this script, which I think is fine script. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thanks for putting up with me. Thanks for putting up with the long wait, y'all, and I'll see you hopefully this week. I don't have a busy week, finally. Hopefully this week with at least the Borderlands 4 DLC review. So yeah, that's all I have for today. Thanks for watching, y'all. Bye!